friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using a whole bunch of Lawn Fawn sets, including Crazy Antics, Oh Gnome, Elfie Selfie, Happy Harvest, and Fairy Friends. So I've stamped my images out on some Neenah Solar White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and then I've also stamped out a bunch of leaves and vines using Lawn Fawn's Noble Fir and Jalapeno inks. So I'll set those off to the side while I do my coloring. I'm using my Copics and starting with the skin tones, and I wanted to show you guys how easy it is to get a variety with just a couple markers. So for the first gnome in the center, I used the E11 as the darkest and blended out with the E00. For the girl, I used the E00 as my darkest and blended out with the E000. And then for the third little gnome, I'm going to use E13 as my darkest and E11 as the lightest. And if you had more space to color, you could use 3 of those marker combinations together, but since they only had a little bit of skin showing, only 2 were fine. I'm also going to use just 2 shades for the little gnome's beard. I used W00 and W1. And then for the girl gnome's hair, I'm using Y21 and Y26. Again, there's only a little bit of it showing, so I use the Y26 as the darkest and blend it out with the Y21. I started out with only 2 shades for the darker mustache and beard for this guy. I used E47 and E49, but I ended up wanting to have just a little bit more lightness in there, so I did pull in the E44 to finish him off. And then I also decided to color in both of the male gnomes' belt and shoes with the darker 2 shades there, just the E47 and the E49. I just added a little bit of E49 on the outside edges and then blended toward the center with the E47. And then rather than introducing any black on the card, I decided to also color the wheel for the wheelbarrow with these same shades. And it's so dark it's going to look almost black anyway, but I just thought it would be a little bit more interesting than the typical black. And for the hat of the gnome down at the bottom, I'm just going to call him Papa Gnome because Papa Smurf had a white beard, he's got a white beard, so anyway, just to keep them apart. But I used R22, R24, and R29 for him. So I'm using that R29 on the outside edges and then blending toward the center with the R24. And then I'm going to finish up with a nice highlight so it looks really nice and round with that R22. And for the other gnome, I thought it would be fun to give him a bright red shirt. So I'm just using those same marker colors, putting the dark on the outside edge and a little bit under his arms as well. And then blending toward the center on his body and towards the top of his arms. And I did forget to do the center of his shirt down below his belt at first, but I will go back and do that in a little bit. I'm also going to use these shades for one of the watermelon slices, and then I felt like I wanted them to be just a little bit lighter, so I ended up adding in the R20 for the other 2. And then I used that to give all 3 of the gnomes some rosy cheeks as well. For Papa Gnome's shirt, I used BG02, BG05, and BG07. I wanted it to be a nice turquoise so that he would look like the Travelocity roaming gnome, if you're familiar with him from the commercials and from The Amazing Race. Funny story, when I worked at AC Moore, we had to dress up for Halloween, and I had never dressed up as a kid, but I decided to make a costume so that I would look like the roaming gnome from the Travelocity commercials. So I used a Santa hat for his hat, and I just cut off the ball and then stitched it up and stuffed it with cotton, and then I made myself a beard out of white felt. Whew, that was hot. It was just a fun experience. For the girl gnome's hat, I took away the BG07. I wanted it to be a little bit lighter, and I added in the BG01. So again, I'm just coloring from the outside with the darkest shades and then blending toward the center so I have that nice bright highlight so it looks really nice and rounded. I'm also going to color the pants of the other boy gnome with these shades, and in the meantime I'm also coloring in the little blanket. I thought it would be fun to make it look like a patchwork quilt, so I'm using all of the colors that I'm using on the card to incorporate into that. For Papa Gnome's pants, I used E51 and E53, and then I did the Girl Gnome's clogs with those shades as well. And I did the wood handle of the wheelbarrow. For the Girl Gnome's dress, I used Y11, Y13, and Y15. I wanted a nice bright sunny yellow for that. So I just used a little Y15 for the darkest and blended out with the Y13 and then the Y11. And I'm also going to use these three shades to color in the other guy Gnome's hat. So same way that I did all the others, since they're all facing in the same direction. So they would all have the same shadow and highlights. I will also use these three shades to color in all of the little flowers. And then I'm going to pull in the Y17 to do the centers. I'll use BG10 and BG11 to add some shading and some pleats on the Girl Gnome's apron. And then I thought I would just quickly show you how I've been doing those quilt squares. I just add the darkest color over on the left hand side and then blend toward the right. And in this case, I'm going to let that fade into the white rather than adding in a third highlight shade. For the wheelbarrow, I'm going to use C0, C1, and C3. I figured I would just give them a metal wheelbarrow rather than having it be a fun color, since I've got so much other fun color going on the rest of the scene. So I used the C3 as my darkest and blended toward the center with the C1, and then the C0 is going to be my highlight. And I did put a much heavier shadow on the left than the right, just because it's kind of tipped in that direction. And then I bet you've been wondering what these speech bubbles have been for. I'm actually going to turn them all into watermelons. So I'm going to be using YG11, YG13, and YG17 to color all of those in. I'm just doing a solid layer on all of these speech bubbles first. And I'm also going to use the same shades to do the watermelon slices. And then once I have all of those filled in, I'm going to grab my G28 and I'm going to start doing some squiggly lines that will just be, you know, the lines that are on a watermelon. And they don't have to look perfect because this is, you know, kind of a cartoony style. So just any little squiggle lines, don't think about it too much, just go for it and it's going to look great. So on some of them I did 5 squiggle lines and some I did 4. I just tried to mix it up and do some different things. And then I trimmed all of these images out with the matching dies. For my background, I took the meadow backdrop landscape and die cut that out of a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock. And then I kept the die together so that I could blend on some Distress Oxide. I'm using tumbled glass with the Lawn Fawn Cloudy Stencil. So I'm going to just keep turning that stencil and working my way down toward the grass, just adding a little bit of color. And then when I get down to the bottom, I'm going to choose a section that's going to cover up those 2 little pieces that are poking out of the grass. Then I will remove the sky portion out carefully, and then I'm going to blend on a bit more of that blue coming up from the bottom, just trying to be really careful so I don't bend those grass pieces. Then I'll press a little bit of that ink onto my work surface, and I'm going to water that down with my Distress sprayer and do a little splatter detail on the background just to give it a little extra interest. Then I will set that aside to dry and work on the rest of the panel. I put 2 little pieces of post-it tape where I wanted the grass to end so I wouldn't get the green ink up in the sky. Now I used some pieces that I had reused a bunch of times for dies. I probably should have taken some fresh pieces because they didn't stick that well, as you'll see. But I'm blending on some Twisted Citron Distress Oxide ink for the bottom part of my grass. And once I have that on, I'm going to add in the mowed lawn, and I'm going to blend that on just the 2 tops of the grassy sections. So I'm just kind of tapping it in certain places so I don't bend too much of those grasses. It's real easy to do, so you have to be careful. And then I'll reblend that out with the Twisted Citron ink blending tool, and there you can see it totally went up there, but that's okay. I'm going to take a little wet baby wipe in just a bit and wipe most of that ink off, and it's not a big deal. Then I just stuck an extra piece of cardstock in there just so I could blend on the top of the grass without getting it on the bottom of the border above. And I did accidentally tear this background too, but it lined right back up, so it wasn't a big deal. There you can see it, it just came apart. But so be careful when you're blending with your distress inks. Don't be like me. I was in a hurry to get this finished, so I wasn't being as careful as I should have. I just blended a little bit of extra ink in that gap area, and you couldn't even tell really on the final card. I'm going to cover up the sky parts so that I can press a little bit of both of those inks on my work surface again and do some more splatter detail just so it matches with the sky. This is a little detail that I just love to add when I'm using distress inks. So once I've got some various sizes of droplets, I will set this part aside to dry, and I'm going to work on stamping my sentiment on the sky portion. And I'm using a sentiment from the On the Beach stamp set and using my jet black ink again. This is the same ink that I use for my images. And I'm stamping out the sentiment that says, "Have a relaxing summer." Then I'm going to grab my card base. I'm using a piece of cilantro cardstock, and I'm going to use the watermelon from Happy Summer and stamp out the sentiment "You've Earned It," which is also from On the Beach, just so that it kind of ties in, you know, have a relaxing summer, you've earned it, which my gnomes certainly will have after they've harvested all of those watermelons. So now I'm just adding a bit of glue tube to the back of my meadow backdrop landscape, and then I'm going to adhere that to the front of my cilantro card base, just smoothing that down into place. And then I will grab the sky portion and I'm going to fit that together just like a puzzle, just making sure that those grass pieces that are kind of poking up fit just perfectly into the recessed area. And I did use my little pokey tool to just make sure everything was pressed down nicely. And now the stage is set for me to adhere my images and have my little scene going on. So I'm going to start with the quilt down at the bottom, front and center on the lower grassy border. And then on the top one over on the left, I'm going to put the wheelbarrow and Papa Gnome. He's going to be kind of pushing that. And then into that, I'm going to add 3 watermelons. So I'm just going to add those so that they look like they're in a nice pile. So I have 2 at the bottom, and then I'm going to add a 3rd one to the pile on the top. My younger guy gnome, I'm going to add to the quilt. He's going to be having his break time, having a tasty snack. So I'm going to add a little piece of watermelon into his hand and just make sure that he's holding onto the rind so his fingers don't get sticky. I'm going to take one of the vines from Fairy Friends and I'm tearing that just to make it a little bit shorter and put that down over on the left hand side there. And then I'll add one of those speech bubble watermelons. And I'm just going to start building my patch. I had a very strong visual in my head, and I wasn't 100% sure that I was going to be able to make it work in stamped form, but I really wanted to try, so I just kind of went for it, and I ended up loving how it turned out. So I just had a really fun time playing with these images and making them as close to that vision that I had in my head as possible. Before I get any further, over on the right hand side, I want to add my little girl gnome so that I make sure that I save room for her. And then I'm going to continue that little watermelon patch going right behind her by tucking in some more of those images. And you might be wondering what I'm going to do about all those pointy ends from the speech bubbles. Well, that's where the leaves come in. So I'm going to just start adding those here and there over top of those little triangle shapes. I'm also going to add them here and there on the vines, just kind of filling in any space that I think that they would look good and making it look like a more complete scene. I also found some little curlicues in that Happy Harvest set that I had forgot to stamp at the beginning, but when I was cutting out everything with the dies, I was like, ooh, those would look really good in this scene too. So I stamped and die cut a bunch of those as well, and I'm tucking those in here and there to just, add even more. And then the flowers, I'm going to tuck the stems back behind stuff as well, so that they can look like the blossoms on the watermelon plants. I put another piece of watermelon in the girl gnome's hand, and I had to adjust that a little bit because I wanted it to look like she was holding the rind as well, because who would hold on to the flesh, So I just fiddled with that a little bit, and then I added the third slice next to the guy gnome down at the bottom on the quilt. And I just felt like the sky was a bit too empty, so I grabbed 2 butterflies from Butterfly Kisses, and I colored those with the darker yellow that I used on the inside of the flowers. And I added those to the sky just to bring some color up there and fill in some of that space. And that is going to complete my card for today. There is another peek at the inside. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I was super nervous that I wasn't going to be able to execute the vision that I had in my head, but I have to say I'm really pleased with how it turned out. So if you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. I post new videos every Monday and Friday. And if you can't wait that long, here are 2 extra videos I thought might also interest you. You can click on either one of those to check them out. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.